It's 7 o'clock on the dot this evening on September 4th. So I will slowly get started as people may trickle in over time. But thank you for joining me. Tonight is a familiar topic. This is one that I covered back in April, and not a whole lot has changed, but there's quite a bit of information. And so if you weren't able to join me back in April, then this information may be new to you, or if you were there, sometimes it's nice to be refamiliarized with the topic at hand, especially because food labels especially can be very difficult to understand fully. And at times they can be confusing even for someone like me, who has had to study them extensively because things do change from time to time. So it's nice to stay up to date on that. So the title, of course, is Decoding Food Labels, a Guide to Informed Grocery Shopping. As I say every week, remember, it's the quality of your calories that matters. And you can see when we look at food labels, they can actually help guide us into finding where we can find those high quality calories. So the nutrient dense instead of just calorie dense foods. So hopefully you can use this information to guide you the next time you find yourself at a grocery store or shopping anywhere else to buy food items. Briefly, let's go over what we're going to cover specifically today. Firstly, we'll cover what is included in a food label, as well as get a basic understanding of the nutrition facts. That's where you see that list of calories and other nutrients. Also, I think it's very important to understand how to interpret label claims. You may see things that say low in X, Y, or Z, reduced, high, good source, and those do have specific definitions. So this can help interpret those a little bit better. There are also some newer or upcoming label changes, some that may be on the horizon and some that you may see happening right now. So I'll just mention those. And also talk about how to use food labels to make those smart choices and to make those high quality food decisions when you're out shopping. And as always, if there are any questions at the end or even during, feel free to hit that bottom question button on the screen, and you can submit your question either anonymously or with your name. And I'm happy to answer questions about this topic or any other nutrition topic that maybe comes to mind. So food labeling, broadly speaking, they are regulated. The FDA is the one in charge of the regulation of food labels, and they are required on the majority of prepared foods. You won't see them on fish or raw produce. I'm sure you can, if you think about it, you've never seen an apple with a nutrition facts label on it. But packaged or prepared foods, you're generally going to see those nutrition facts labels. There are some exceptions to this, of course, just like I mentioned, the fish and raw produce. But if you go to a farmer's market, then you will most likely not see any food labels on some smaller sellers. But for those that do have a food label on them, there are required parts. So these are standard and you should see them everywhere on the packaging. And that includes the name of the food, the quantity. So when you see the net weight somewhere, also there will be an ingredient list in order of weight, essentially. So the heaviest item is usually listed first, or of course, if it's just in a greater quantity, therefore making it the heaviest. That's the order you'll see it in. They also list out any food allergens. So you will see those phrases like may contain soy, et cetera, et cetera. You also see that nutrition facts portion. And while not everyone searches this out, it should be on there somewhere on your packaging with the name and address of the manufacturer, the producer, or the distributor of that food. Also, you may see nutrient content or health claims, like I was talking about low in or good source, et cetera. Those again, do have specific definitions. So in order for a food to have that listed on their label, they have to adhere to specific definitions by the FDA. As you may know, food labels will undergo changes every now and again. And you may remember when the nutrition facts label was updated back in 2016. Of course, the updates do take time and manufacturers are given some lead time. So the manufacturers were required to use the new label by July 1st of 2021. And so you can see on the left-hand screen here, the original label. So you may remember this one where you'd see the calories in smaller print, calories from fat to the side, but that did change with the new label. Also, calories is in a much larger font. And so among the changes, you'll see that the percent daily value, which is on the right hand of these squares, those were updated based on some newer established daily values for certain nutrients. So sometimes based on research and findings, they will adjust the amount that they would consider a reasonable daily value. Also at the bottom where you'll see vitamins and minerals, so this little bottom portion of the square, you may have noticed that vitamins A and C are no longer required. However, vitamin D and potassium are required. That doesn't mean that they might not list vitamins A and C. There are some food labels that really almost make it a point to list out their vitamins and minerals, and that's beyond the required amount, but this is what the new requirements have. Also, like I mentioned before, the calories from fat have been removed. And the main reason for that is because it's been determined that it's not necessarily the calories from fat that matter as much as where the fat is coming from. So when we see saturated fat, trans fat, unsaturated fat, we want to limit our saturated fats and avoid trans fats altogether. And that was more important to focus on than just calories from fat. Also, added sugars are now required. And that is something that I think is very specific and important to mention, that while you may have seen sugars listed underneath total carbohydrates in the original label, that didn't necessarily mean added sugars. And added sugars are any type of sugar that is added to the food that wouldn't otherwise exist naturally. So if you had a jar of honey, is that sugar? Yes. By the definition, it's a sugar product. So if it had a nutrition label, which it's unlikely that it would, but if it did, you would see total sugars, but you wouldn't see any added sugars. However, if honey is added to a different food, then that is then counted as added sugar. Also, you can think about that as white sugars, making things sweet. And so it is important to sort of differentiate between those. Let's dive into the nutrition facts just a little bit more, because I was pointing out a few things, but I find that this image does a very good job in pointing out the very specific sections that are in the nutrition facts label. So you can see that with serving information, you will find the number of servings per container as well as serving size. And this is where some people can get confused, because the serving size is based on what somebody might eat or drink, although there are some people who definitely disagree with some of these serving sizes that are listed, feeling that it might be too much or too little, depending on what food they're looking at. But it is based on what has been established as the typical intake. That doesn't mean that it is the recommended amount. So just because say, for example, this says 2/3 of a cup, if whatever this product is, you might eat 1/3 of a cup, that's okay. Or if it's double, that's also okay. However, it's very important to know that everything that follows is based off of this serving size. So the calories are based off of this 2/3 of a cup. Therefore, if you eat double that, then you have to double the calories, and as well as all of these other nutrients underneath. Moving on to the nutrients, of course, this is called the key nutrients that impact your health. And so we want to try and limit, like I mentioned, saturated fat. Also, sodium is an area of concern for many people. And like I had mentioned, added sugars. So we wanted to have those listed there. Also on this right-hand side, and this is an area that can trip a lot of people up, which is the daily value. And that is the percentage of a reference amount to reach or avoid exceeding. And I think it's important to mention that because you'll see added sugars here has a daily value. And I want to make it very clear that there is no recommended minimum amount of added sugars that somebody needs to have. And I think sometimes people feel like these daily values mean that, oh, I've gotten 20% of my added sugars, I still need to get 80 more percent, and that's not true. So it's more talking about how much it's contributing. And so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And of course, further speaking on the daily values, this can sort of give you an example of how it shows how much or little of a food is contributing to those nutrients on the label. And there are some that you want to limit, as we've mentioned, but others that you want to try and get maybe a minimum. I tried to show this example in this image just above here where we see the listed nutrients here, as well as the daily value. So that's the total daily value, such as 20 grams of saturated fat. That would be 100% of the saturated fat. And so your aim here is to ideally get less than 20 grams of saturated fat, broadly speaking. Some people need less than even that. It sort of depends. The general guidelines are that you don't want to have more than 10% of your calories coming from saturated fat, but that requires quite a bit of math. And so this is a little more of a quick notation if you're reading a food label here. Sodium, of course, also you want to be less than, but when it comes to things like fiber, as well as these vitamins and minerals, this is more of a minimum, or at least. There is always exceptions, but that's generally what these daily values are guiding you toward. Also, if a nutrient is listed as being 5% or less per serving on the daily value, then that is considered low in that specific nutrient. And that comes in handy later when we're talking about those label claims. Also, if it's 20% or more per serving, then that can be considered high. Again, handy if they want to use those types of terms on their labeling. And I wanted to let you know what you can also use that as a reference point. And I mentioned label claims where we're talking about low and high. And let's try and make a little more sense of those because there are a few. There's three main kinds of label claims that you may run into. So the first two I have listed here, which are health claims. So that is something that describes a relationship between a food substance and then a reduced risk of a disease or health-related condition. So on this box of Cheerios, you'll see where it talks about a type of food, soluble fiber, and how of course, then they also say from whole grain oat foods like Cheerios, and it talks about how this may reduce the risk of heart disease. So that would be a health claim. There are also structure and function claims where it can describe that role of a nutrient or dietary ingredient and intended to affect the normal structure or function of the human body. A little bit of a tough definition to understand, but a good example is calcium builds strong bones. So you may see those types of claims on yogurt or on other dairy products. And then the third claim, and this is the one that I think can be the most confusing, and that is the nutrient content claims. And this is where we're looking at those daily value percentages, and they can make claims such as high, rich in, or an excellent source. And those can be very helpful in marketing purposes. If you're saying it's an excellent source of calcium, that may be more attractive to someone. Or high in fiber, also an attractive item for many people. So that is something that is worth looking at, but also be aware of what sometimes it might be promoting. So like I said before, if it's greater than or equal to 20% of the daily value, they can make that claim. You may also see something that says good source, where that's 10 to 19% of the daily value. Then the more complicated claims, and the ones that I think can frustrate people or potentially confuse people, are the terms such as reduced. And that means 25% less of something when compared to usually the original product. So I've listed an example because this is sort of a notorious example if we're looking at soups. I'm sure you've seen soups where it says reduced sodium. And what that means is that it is about 25% less than what the original soup would be. So as an example, I have here in the original packaging of tomato basil soup, it is 690 milligrams here. And then a reduced sodium creamy tomato basil soup, which is at 480 milligrams. But I want to mention here, if you look over at the percent daily value, you'll still see with the 480 milligrams of sodium in the reduced, it's still considered high in sodium because it's 21% of the daily value per serving. So even if it's reduced, it does not mean low. And I think that's very important to mention. And finally, free. I find that one can be sometimes confusing because if you're really reading a label, you might see that something says fat-free or sugar-free, but then you'll see that in the ingredients, perhaps, there is a fat or sugar involved. And it does depend on the type of nutrient we're talking about, but essentially if it's less than 5 calories or less than 0.5 grams of sugar or fat, we can say that it is free in those items. We've essentially rounded down. So keep that in mind because, of course, if you're eating more than that serving size, what may have been free might not actually mean free, and now you're getting maybe a gram. That's still not quite a lot, but something to mention. Along with those label claims, there is a claim that I haven't run into very often, but I do know it exists, and that's the term healthy. And actually, this was a recent change where foods that used to be called healthy, I think we've all sort of realized by now, maybe not so much. So in December 2024, the FDA updated what foods can actually claim themselves as healthy on their products. And again, that could be very appealing in a marketing strategy, but they still have to meet certain requirements. And this website gives a very good example of different types of foods and the requirements that are necessary. But essentially, they must meet a minimum amount of at least one food group. So fruits or vegetables, grains, protein, etc. And they cannot exceed limits that are established for added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. And like I mentioned, the amounts determined for these established limits they differ between types of foods. So again, the website at the very bottom where it says fda.gov/healthy, they do give you a lot of examples. But I just want to mention, because this infographic here is very interesting, you can see up on the top here, the foods that qualify for the healthy claim. They make sense if you look at them. We've got fruits, whole vegetables, we've got salmon, of course, fatty fish, water, eggs, and also plain low-fat or fat-free yogurt. And that's one that I think is very important to mention because I'm sure you may know that we used to think of all yogurts as very healthy. But many yogurts are quite high in added sugars to the point where I would almost consider them to be desserts. Also, certain cereals can be high in added sugars, I'm sure you're aware. White breads, fruit juice, or fruit punch. So yeah, not 100% juice, although I would still say eating the whole fruit is ideal. But any type of fruit punches, like I'm sure people have had Capri Suns or high C's and things like that, where it's not 100% juice. If it's not 100% juice, then that could be a concern. I do believe a couple of those brands offer some 100% juice options, of course. So I just wanted to mention that. So I think this was an overall good change because we don't want to be fooled into making choices where we think that they're healthy just because it has a fruit item in it. So, or that it has fortified cereal. And so this was, I think, a very beneficial, positive change to change our mindset also on what really is healthy. An additional change, which as of right now is on the horizon, it can take some time for changes to be implemented. And the last I saw, the FDA is still, they proposed a rule about this requirement of front of package nutrition labels, which I've given an example here on the right-hand side. The last I saw, they were taking additional feedback or comments. I believe that was June or July of this year. So that's the last I know of it. But they proposed that this could be on the front of the package so that if you're shopping, you can do a quick look on this smaller box. So it's not the full nutrition facts, but it's some quick nutrition info on some nutrients of concern. So saturated fat, sodium, added sugars. They would list the percent of the daily value. And then for all of us to have a bit of an easier time, they would list whether these amounts are medium, high, or low in those nutrients. So since these are nutrients of concern that many people want to limit, we can quickly look and find out whether or not this type of food would be good or maybe not so great for your individual needs. I'm hopeful that this will be added just because I think it can be a very handy tool. And again, a bit quicker when you're passing through the grocery store than having to pick up every type of item and read over it. So making healthy choices by using food labels. This is what we're all here for. We want to see about how we can get those higher quality calories. And so some of my top recommendations are to focus on the protein, focus on the fiber content. And also, as has been mentioned before, try and limit your sodium, your saturated fat, and your added sugar intake. Like we've talked about, the percent daily value can quickly give you some advice on whether that nutrient is high or low, 20% or 5%. But also you can use the nutrition facts and the food labels with other tools, such as the Altman rule, to help pick healthier options. And we'll touch on the Altman rule in the next slide. And then finally, you can check the ingredients, because ideally a shorter list of ingredients, the simpler list, it tends to be a better choice, or at least less processed. There are some exceptions to this in case there are many additional vitamins or fortifications, which still makes it processed, but we know that we're not just adding a bunch of unimportant items to the ingredients. So to talk about the Altman rule here, we can use the nutrition facts label to touch on whether or not it's a good, especially carbohydrate-based choice. So the general formula here is that the grams of fiber, which we want it to be greater than or equal to 3 grams, plus grams of protein, must be greater than grams of sugar. And it is important to note that they do actually mean at total sugars, not just added sugars. Sometimes I make exceptions depending on what the food is. For example, if it were a yogurt, I'm more interested in the added sugars than total because there will be some lactose involved. But Altman rule doesn't work quite so well on yogurts simply because you're unlikely to find too much fiber, save for a few options. But anyhow, we can see here the dietary fiber listed is 4 grams. So that meets that rule of greater than or equal to 3 grams of fiber per serving. And then we can also see that the protein is at 3 grams per serving. So now we are at 7 total grams with those added together. And then the total sugars on this product was just 1 gram. So does this meet the ultimate rule? As in, is this going to be a healthier choice where we're going to get a little more balance, high value protein and fiber and not so much sugar? Yes. And so I think this can be very handy, especially if blood sugars are something that you want to be mindful of. So putting this all together, it can be a wordy and involved topic, but food labels in general can help us make more informed decisions. We have a lot of choices on what we can choose to eat. And so being able to use food labels to our advantage can be very handy if we know what to look for. And so that's why they can appear daunting to start with. And hopefully this helped break through a little bit. Remember that health claims, nutrient content claims, those are strictly regulated. So as long as you know what low or reduced means, then that can benefit you. And you can also know when those terms really aren't that helpful for your specific case. I should mention the term natural is not regulated. So seeing that on a label really doesn't mean a whole lot. I figured it's beneficial for me to let you know on that too. And then just remember that label updates, additions, they're ongoing. You may see those info boxes coming up in the near future, and no doubt there will be more changes even 10 years from now, perhaps. As research changes, then so does the nutrition facts and the nutrient labels. And so keep your eyes open. And of course, if you ever have questions about those, you can always reach out to a dietitian and such as myself, and happy to answer any of those questions. And speaking of, we have come to the end here. So if you have any questions, now's your opportunity, and I welcome any and all. All right. Well, I think that about does it. I hope that you found this informative. And of course, if you do have additional questions that you didn't have a chance to ask tonight, by all means, reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff, and they can either send your question to me or they may have that answer as well. We're always happy to help. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye.